Before I start talking about the current state of the conservative movement, I want to tell one quick Whittaker Chambers story. I help put together a dinner every Halloween called the Pumpkin Papers Irregulars in Washington, which commemorates Whittaker Chambers and raises a lot of issues. Some of you have been there, I know, and certainly Stan has spoken to it. But you pick up all these little things about Whittaker Chambers, and there's one great story that I like to tell, that when Chambers had finished writing Witness, and he wrote it out largely longhand, he wanted to have it published by the largest or one of the largest American publishers, and Roger, as a fellow book publisher, enjoyed the story. So he called and made an appointment to see Bennett Cerf at Random House. And they gave him his time a week later, and he came in and introduced himself to the woman sitting at the front desk and said that he was here to see Bennett Cerf. And so she called up to his office and she said, Whittaker Chambers is here. And there was a pause on the other end of the phone, and he said, "Get that son of a bitch out of here." And apparently Cerf had an intern who worked for him who had really never said anything before. He would sort of help with his files and so on. And he sort of stood up and he said, "Mr. Cerf, you're making a mistake." He said, "Whittaker Chambers is an eminent man. He's got a very powerful story to tell, and I suspect he's written a book that needs to be published, and you should see him." And he did. And of course, Random House did publish it. Roger, we bought the paperback rights about 10 years later and then subsequently published it. To start with, of course, when Whittaker Chambers was, when he published Witness, there really was no conservative movement. There were a few people that spoke about anti-communism, and there were a few people that spoke about free market economics, and a few people who spoke about traditional values, but they weren't a movement, and they really didn't know each other. There was no support, of course, as there is now. When Witness was published, it certainly caused a sensation, but it wasn't because it was a conservative versus a liberal book. It was a book that was a spy story, for one thing, as well as being a great piece of literature. It was, I think, an instant bestseller, stayed on the list for a long time, but it wasn't because there was a conservative movement. The conservative movement evolved over the next, well, 20, 30 years. Perhaps it's still evolving. When National Review was founded in 1955, of course, that brought a lot of the people together. Interestingly, many of the people that were there at National Review were former communists. Not only Whittaker Chambers, but Frank Meyer, James Burnham, Willie Schlamm, a good many others who were really the guiding lights there, and who, but then you have to understand that as the conservative movement grew, anti-communism really was the kernel that kept it together. It was the driving force. It was what actually recruited activist people. It's what organizations were started around. There was a lecture circuit in the 50s of people that went around the country speaking largely about communism. I recall, as I was growing up, my father published countless books, and there was book after book about communism. Many of them were deeply intellectual books about the theory of communism. Others were the more practical books about what it was all about, but it was really a big deal. We forget that in American foreign policy, until the fall of the Soviet Union, the entire focus was basically the Soviet Union and communism and the things that emanated from it. The intelligence community, the counterintelligence community, was all focused on communism. So as the conservative movement grew into the 60s and 70s, continually communism was the focus. As I mentioned, there were the other strands of it, the libertarians or the economic conservatives, some of whom were actually rather critical of the anti-communists because they felt that it meant that it would just increase the size of government. But nevertheless, they were second stringers, if you will. Hayek and von Mises, who were contemporaries, really, of Chambers, and Russell Kirk as well, really were the ones, Richard Weaver, that represented the other two strands of it. But until the 70s, probably, communism was the dominant thing. Something I've wondered about is when Ronald Reagan was elected, whether, as you look at the history of the conservative movement, anti-communism became much less of a deal. And I wonder if, with Ronald Reagan, the people that were anti-communist felt that they now had this anti-communist in charge, who was the commander-in-chief, and they felt comfortable enough letting him fight communism that they didn't need to put the same amount of emphasis into it that they had, and focus turned to other things. Anyway, so let's turn for a few minutes to where the movement is today after anti-communism. And of course, we've had, what, 20, 25 years since communism to figure out where the conservative movement goes. But there are certainly, I think, some things that are different, but a great many things are the same. Basically, the tenets of conservatism are the same as they were when people first started talking about them. And I've struggled a lot with just what is it that conservatives believe. I know it's a question that we always are asked, and it's often difficult to come up with a coherent answer. And the four things that I sort of call the pillars of conservatism, which I think all fit together and which probably define it as well as anything else, are the following: liberty, which of course means the exercise of free will and the pursuit of virtue; the rule of law and the protection of minorities, of due process, predictability, the Constitution; the third would be tradition and order; and the fourth, belief in God. And here we come back to the question that we asked before. And I think that even if you go back and you look at the Greek and the Roman philosophers, the British philosophers, the Constitution, you're going to find all of those four things in virtually every phrase that comes along. And they all fit together amazingly well. I've been reading the last couple of weeks the new biography of Thomas Jefferson by John Meacham. Very interesting book. And I noticed that consistently in quoting Jefferson, and he has a great many things in there that I've never seen before, that quotes and discussions of Jefferson, that you look at he's always talking about liberty, the rule of law, tradition and order, and belief in God. And I think that really defines, probably as well as anything I can think of, where the conservative movement comes from today. Now let me talk just a little bit about the current, more political part of the movement. I am certainly part of it, as many of you are. And we've, of course, come out of a campaign, and the left, as they always do, say, well, that's the end of conservatism. And I remember back in 1964 when Goldwater was defeated, the New York Times announced that that was not only the end of conservatism, but republicanism as well. And of course, we, as people say, we've been here before, and it doesn't really make a great deal of difference. The movement goes along. Certainly, the conservative movement, I think, probably defines American politics as much as any other thing right now. By exit polls and by other polls, people define themselves as conservative by about 2 to 1. To liberals, it's around 40 to 20% of the population, something like that, and goes up and down depending on what's happening. I think it's probably safe to say that the country is still center-right. The conservative movement is actually about as cohesive and together, I think, as it ever has been. I'm part of a group that meets every week that Ed Meese chairs in Washington, that's made up of about 25 or 30 leaders of the conservative movement, presidents of organizations, and it includes the libertarians, it includes the Christian conservatives, it includes the foreign policy conservatives, neoconservatives, everybody else, and we pretty much all get along on everything. I don't think there are very many things that we disagree on. We discuss every issue that comes along every week, and we also have 2 meetings a year that bring in the heads of about 100 conservative organizations. We just had one 2 or 3 weeks ago, just after the election, and I can say that they are as enthusiastic as ever. The movement continues to grow. There are always new young writers coming along. There are all sorts of periodicals, of course, and things that are vibrant for any movement like that that's going to stay alive. And so I think, generally speaking, given the ups and downs of politics, it's probably in as good shape as it's ever has been. I'm the chairman of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Others of you in this room have certainly participated there. Again, it's an organization of students that is growing, that constantly is doing a number of amazing things on college campuses across the country. It has, I believe, the largest list of professors associated with it of any organization in the country outside the Association of American University Professors. I think it's somewhere in the 15 to 20,000 range of American professors. So there are all sorts of things going on, and it will continue to go on. Simply to summarize, coming back to Whittaker Chambers, I think that it's probably safe to say that what Chambers did, as was mentioned earlier in the conference, was to introduce people to the fact that communism was a real threat and that it coalesced people. The fact that I think Bill Buckley brought Chambers to National Review was a stroke of genius, and I commemorate the Buckley program here for doing this program on Chambers as the second one you've done, because I think I think he was probably one of the most important people, even for the short span of time that he was at National Review, for what he stood for. So let me stop there and let Peter go on.
Thank you. First, I want to say it's an honor to be on the same panel with two men who have done so much to build conservatism in America. I have a short answer and a long answer to the question that we were asked to address. The short answer to the question, what defines conservatism in America today, is devotion to conserving the principles of limited government in America. Now my longer answer. As for Whittaker Chambers, so too, it seems to me, for us, the defense of freedom today depends on reconciling freedom and tradition. As Norman Podhoretz points out, Chambers didn't manage to do that in witness or in his thinking, for all of his great accomplishments. The reconciliation of freedom and tradition depends upon a virtue called political moderation. The problem today is that the virtue of political moderation is out of favor, but it has distinguished roots in American constitutionalism and in modern conservatism. And recovering and cultivating political moderation is essential to the renewal of a constitutional conservatism, one that's devoted to liberty and self-government. And it's a kind of conservatism around which, as Al Regnery was saying, around which both social conservatives and libertarians can rally. I quote now, "It is a misfortune, inseparable from human affairs, that public measures are rarely investigated with that spirit of moderation which is essential to a just estimate of the real tendency to advance or obstruct the public good." So observed James Madison in Federalist number 37. The challenge, Madison went on to explain, is more sobering still. That's because the spirit of moderation, quote again, is more apt to be diminished than promoted by those occasions which require an unusual exercise of it, closed quote. In a similar spirit, and in the years that America was declaring independence and launching our great experiment in constitutional self-government, Edmund Burke sought to conserve in Great Britain the conditions under which liberty flourished. To this end, Burke exposed the errors of depending on abstract theory for guidance in practical affairs. He taught the supremacy in political life of prudence, or the judgment born of experience, bound up with circumstances and bred in action. He maintained that good policy and laws must be fitted to the people's moral sentiments and opinions. He demonstrated that in politics, the imperfections of human nature must be taken into account and virtue must be respected. And he showed that political moderation frequently counsels rejecting the path of least resistance, and political moderation is sometimes exercised in defending principle staunchly against majority opinion.